Okay, so welcome to our webinar, 3 Easy Ways to Improve Your English and Spanish Syntax. This is going to be a 30-minute webinar. We ask that if you're not muted to please mute yourself. We have, like Joe said, 105 people registered. Yes, so please mute yourself. In this webinar, Joe will be presenting French into English examples and tips for translators working in that direction. And I will be presenting English into Spanish examples and tips for translators. We ask you that if you have any questions during our 30-minute webinar, to type them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them at the very end. So, Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, my name is Joachim Lépine. I go by Joe, and I'm a certified translator with my own translation business here in Quebec, Canada. I've been teaching college translation courses for, I think, around 13 years now, which doesn't sound very lucky, but I love what I do, and I've been teaching professional development courses as well around the world in the last few years, thanks to Zoom. So I'm absolutely delighted to be doing this super short webinar with 3 quick tips to improve your English syntax. And thank you so much for Annalise. You're the one who thought of doing this. So thank you for the invite.
Yeah, of course. I'm really happy to be doing this too. And I'm happy you jumped on board. All right. So my name is Salotti. I'm a translator specialized in environmental sciences, audiovisual, and the US Hispanic community issues. I'm originally from Argentina, where I received a BA in translation back in 2006. And then I moved to Australia, got my master's degree in translation. And then when I moved here in the US, I started teaching. So I combined translation with some teaching. I taught some general translation courses and specialized translation courses like medical translation, financial translation, and audiovisual translation for CUNY, for the City University of New York at Hunter College, and NYU, the NYU master's degree, and the certificate too. And after a few sabbatical years that I took when I had my baby, I decided to start offering some courses through my website too, and that's what I'm doing, like this webinar. So I'm very, very excited to be back teaching after a few years of just being a mom, and yeah, very happy to be doing this today. So what if we start? I'm going to share screen. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides there. Do you see them?
Yep.
Perfect. So 3 easy ways to improve your Spanish syntax. So how can I put this so that it's not there? Syntactic flexibility is my first tip. Spanish is one of the most yogis languages out there. So my first tip is to make use of that flexibility. And one easy way to do that is try and not finish a sentence in Spanish with a verb. So in syntactic terms, languages are in a very macro syntactic structure. They are structured as subject, verb, and object. That's the main syntactic order for languages. English is definitely one of those SVO, or subject, verb, object languages. Now, Spanish would like to say that it's an SVO, a subject, verb, object language, but in reality, the way we speak and the way we write is not a subject, verb, object language. It's more like a verb, object, subject, or verb, subject, object. So the very practical way of trying to apply this syntactic knowledge is by not finishing a sentence with a verb. So English does that. So in this example, for example, we have last night a draft majority opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization was leaked. And the sentence ends there with the verb. Now, we can, of course, translate this very literally in the sense of the structure and say, anoche la opinión preliminar de la mayoría de la Corte Suprema sobre la causa Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization se filtró. Now, in Spanish, that is correct. Now, the problem with that is that by the time we finish the sentence, we had already forgotten the subject. We already are forgetting what we're talking about. So a way to improve this and make it more smooth and more natural is to put the verb at the very beginning. So you would have, anoche se filtró la opinión preliminar de la mayoría de la Corte Suprema sobre la causa Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Tiny syntactic change makes the whole difference in this sentence. That is complex, it's long, so try not to finish a Spanish sentence with a verb. Another tip, quick tip, repeated subjects. So in English, we have to include subjects in all our sentences. The reason for this is that verbs really don't tell you what the subject is. You have to express it in your sentence. So you have, I bought a car yesterday. I had to sell it or turn it back the next day. I was very sorry. I feel terrible about the mistake I made. So it's in all the sentences, we're all talking about I, but I have to say it. There's no way I get to not repeat that subject, that pronoun, that I. Now, in Spanish, we don't repeat subject pronouns, especially if they're pronouns, personal pronouns, because we can assume the person that is doing the action from the way the verb is, what is called in Spanish, la desinencia verbal. So if I have a verb, it's already telling me, like caminé, the way it ends, la desinencia, the ending, is telling me already that it's I who did that action. So we need to make the most of that, especially if we already established the person before, the context is already very clear. When it's not clear, then we have a problem. But if it's clear, then we don't have to repeat that pronoun anymore. So in this case, I have two very simple examples here. I bought a car yesterday. Ayer compré un coche. So there's no ayer yo compré un coche. In fact, if I actually do include the subject there in Spanish, I'm including an emphasis that wasn't present in the English. So in the second example, I said, I gave you the book yesterday, and then a perfect translation, or well, perfect, there's no such a thing as perfect translation, but a good option for translation is ayer te di el libro. If I say, yo te di el libro, ayer yo te di el libro, I'm actually including the subject there, and I'm actually emphasizing the fact that I gave you the book as opposed to someone else. So by including the subject pronoun all the time, and I'm going to show you an example like that, I'm first of all creating a very clunky sentence, and second of all, I'm including emphasis that wasn't present in my original text. And I'll give you a challenge for the subject, the repeated subject. This is an actual example that I gave some of my students a while ago from a text. And the English says, Diéresis, a lawyer in his 30s, says he was goaded into activism by an appallingly punctuated piece of graffiti on a wall he frequently passed by. I couldn't believe that in just 2 sentences, there were more than 10 grammatical errors, he said over a cappuccino spiked with amaretto. So I bolded all the pronouns that are functioning as subjects. Diéresis is the first one, but then he, I, he. Now, one of the translations that I got in the class for feedback was this one. And you'll find other problems in this sentence, and I'll leave you this sentence with you so that you can try and find the problems. But I want you to first now consider or concentrate on the repetition of subjects and how clunky this whole paragraph feels with all the pronouns being repeated. This is an extreme, but the problem is that because we're translating from English, we get so stuck on what English says that we translate the order. We translate, in this case, the repeated subjects into Spanish, and it's not what we should get if we want to find a more natural, smoother, and better translation. So the translation is: Diéresis, un abogado en sus 30s, dijo que él fue impulsado a este activismo por un graffiti terriblemente puntuado en una calle por donde él pasaba frecuentemente. Sobre una taza de capuchino con amaretto, él dijo: yo no podía creer que en tan solo 2 oraciones habían más de 10 errores gramaticales. So I'm not going to comment on this, but I'll leave you with this for you to think. And I can share with you my presentation, and you can, look at it at home and see if you can improve this. All right. Third and last tip, linguistic richness. So languages are rich, right? They're there to convey a whole array of meanings and expression and emotions, and we use it for our human communication. So they are rich. Now, the sources from where they take that richness is different from language to language. And English and Spanish differ in that case. One big difference they take is prepositions. So English has several hundreds prepositions. So you can see by the number that it's already placing a lot of richness in how English uses prepositions. Now, Spanish has less than 30. So you have 200 prepositions in English, and then you have 30 prepositions in Spanish. So you can see Spanish is not very rich in prepositions. We don't use them as much. We're always repeating the same prepositions over and over again. So when we find prepositions in English, please try to not translate them literally. So I'm going to give you very easy, quick examples. No rivers flow into the Texas Laguna. So you have a phrasal verb, flow into. Phrasal verb is made up of a verb plus a preposition, or more than one, can be 2 up to 3, 4 prepositions even in English. So flow into is a phrasal verb. And yeah, you can translate this as no hay ningún río que fluya hacia la Laguna, Texas. Okay. But a better translation is to find a verb that can convey both the verb in English plus the preposition in English. Just one verb sometimes works wonders to translate that preposition. So, no hay ningún río que desemboque en la Laguna, Texas. Desembocar is conveying flow into. There's no prepositions whatsoever. And that's what we need to try and find when we're translating prepositional verbs or phrasal verbs. Another example. A few days later, driving out of Corpus Christi, we pass field after field of brown stubble. Yes, we can say mientras conducíamos fuera de Corpus Christi, but we can also say cuando salíamos de Corpus Christi. So we're using out of and switching that into a verb, if that makes sense. So a los pocos días, cuando salíamos de Corpus Christi en coche, maybe we can add en coche so that we can convey the idea of driving. And we are conveying the idea of driving with a noun and the idea of out of with a verb. And because I like challenges, whoop, what happened here? There, this one. I don't know what happened there. So linguistic richness challenge. And this is also, I'm going to leave you with this. It's an extreme example of using prepositions here, but it says automatic voter registration makes voter registration opt out instead of opt in. Eligible citizens who interact with government agencies are registered to vote or have their existing registration information updated unless they affirmatively decline. So in this case, we definitely cannot use something like optar fuera or optar dentro. So we really have to do our flexibility here to change this and not translate a preposition for a preposition. So that's the end of my my tips. And yeah, I'm happy to give Joe the next part of the webinar. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Annalise. And let me just say, I love listening to you speak in Spanish. I wish I had some recordings, just like listen to them from time to time. It's just so amazing. It's just a beautiful language, and it's so refreshing. It's not one that we hear very often here in Quebec.
It's an Argentine Spanish, so I have a lot of sh that other Latin Americans and Spanish from Spain don't have.
Amazing. Yeah, and so fascinating to look at your points as well, because in English, we're going to look at how some of those things stack up and see what things hold true and are similar to Spanish perhaps, and what's different. So let's have a look. I've got a few slides of my own here. Give me just a second to get set up. Alrighty, and I can't see anyone anymore. Are you still there?
Yes, we are.
Okay, all right. I'm not seeing anyone's image, but that's okay. So let's jump in, and I'm going to sort of talk about the same points, but from the English perspective, and see if we can maybe tease out a few general observations about how we do things. So this is a question Annalise and I discussed before doing the webinar today. Which language is more flexible? And which language is perhaps more rigid? And before I go into this example, I just want to tell you a story, an anecdote. I was translating for a professor a few years back, and I was working with him in his office because the texts he had me translate were really, really complicated. And these were long academic articles, and the professor was from France. He had been trained in the old kind of Pierre Bourdieu style of writing. So some of his sentences were half a page long. And I remember kind of nervously asking him, I couldn't hold back. I just told him, like, isn't it exhausting for you to write these unbelievably long and complex sentences when you're producing these articles? Like, how do you even wrap your brain around this? And he kind of blinked it, and he said, you know, Joe, it's funny, I always saw it as the other way around, that French is a language that's freer than English. And he said, when I'm reading your English translations, I can see that you're switching things back into a lot more subject, verb, object, like what Annalise was talking about earlier. And I thought that was fascinating because from my perspective, I thought it must be so hard to write in a very Baroque style, like they say in French, alambiqué. And here he was telling me he thinks it's the opposite. It must be harder to restrict language into sort of a very linear sequence and shorten things up, whereas French can put things in many different parts of the sentence, you know, frequently interrupting subject and verb, frequently interrupting verb and object, frequently using front loading, so long subordinate clauses at the beginning of the sentence. So like he was saying, French is actually freer in its expression and offers more opportunities, whereas in English, if you get too fancy, you're going to lose your reader. I thought that was just a really fascinating conversation that we had. And just to sort of make this a little bit more concrete, I have a fun little challenge for you here. This was a text that maybe illustrates what I'm talking about in terms of the flexibility of our respective languages. So in French, we had le tiers des répondants affirment se sentir en confiance quant à leur avenir financier, alors qu'un point de vue pessimiste prime chez les deux autres tiers. Totally normal sentence, right, in French? Totally fine. And so the translator wrote 1/3 of the respondents say they feel confident about their financial future, while a pessimistic outlook prevails among 2/3. Isn't that interesting? So the English attempted to do this sort of sentence yoga, if you will, try to be as flexible as the French, but perhaps you can write in the chat what is wrong with this or what could be improved. See if you can spot it. There's something here that's awkward in English in the way that the overall structure of the sentence. Any takers? All right, and I see that many of you are writing that there's something unnatural about that 2/3, right? Something there doesn't feel quite right, doesn't sit quite right, and you're all correct. And Anne-Marie, bravo. Anne-Marie takes the cake. That's exactly right. The two parts of this implicit comparison are not parallel. And so this is only one instance of English being a little bit less free in its sentence structure. If you have two parts of a sentence that are describing things of a like nature, in English, we will use parallel style rather than to suddenly switch the anticipated word order on the reader. So this is not always a matter of active and passive voice. That's a separate topic that we can look at in a different webinar, but it's actually really a matter of the natural order that we follow in English. We will naturally write in a parallel style, in a more perhaps predictable style as well. So maybe English is less about yoga, more about taking slow walks, walking from place A to B. We're a little bit less yoga inclined perhaps than our French counterparts. So you can see that this doesn't sit right, and bravo to everyone who pointed it out. And so you can have a look at the rewrite where we simply reinstated the anticipated order here. 1/3 of the respondents reported feeling confident about their financial future, while 2/3 expressed pessimism. Isn't that easier to read? Suddenly you almost feel like you can breathe again. And it's very easy to follow. So English is parallel, but beyond parallelism, we also follow anticipated sequences. And in all implicit and explicit comparisons, and in all descriptions of things of a like nature, we will use the anticipated sequence and use the same sequence for the two parts of the sentence that are comparing. Moving on to repeated subjects, this was Annalise's second point. And so she was saying that we shouldn't repeat subject pronouns in Spanish if we can avoid it. And I thought that was a super interesting point, because what I've noticed in English is that translators have an unfortunate tendency to almost slavishly reproduce the subject when they see it in French. And so I've taken an actual existing text. I didn't write this. I just tweaked it a little bit at the beginning to preserve confidentiality. Friendly customer service is a core value of our organization. However, this value may be compromised if we opt for chatbots that provide an impersonal response. And so you might think this doesn't read so poorly, right? But it's a little bit odd that we're restating this value. And in fact, in the original source text, they didn't restate value. So I reintroduced it to show you what often happens in English translation, which is that we will reproduce the subject that's explicit in French, whereas in English, very often a this or that or these or those will do just fine. And we don't, once the subject is clear, we don't need to restate it in every sentence. This is why sometimes when you're reading over an English translation, something feels weird, something feels unnecessarily heavy or unwieldy or just the slightest bit off, and you can't quite put your finger on it. And very often this is the case, is that we are restating the subject constantly, whereas we do not have that anaphoric reference need that the French has. So if you look, I've provided a quick list here of words that I've noticed that translators overuse. So if you're a French into English translator, or you translate from another language, watch out for overuse of words like project, initiative, issue, problem, or the dreaded mandate when used in the French sense of a matter or an issue or a file or just a job or something else. So that's a sort of a word level issue. But these words I find in English translations that I revise, these are very frequently like all over the place in English. And the reader is kind of going like, huh? Because they already understand what we're talking about. It was clear at the beginning of the paragraph. And yet, because it's constantly restated, it just sounds a little bit wonky. So these are all words that I've noticed that we tend to overuse in English translations. So when you're reviewing your translations, you can perhaps think, can I drop some of these once the subject is clear? Or else your English will start to sound just a little bit stilted and odd. And wrapping up here, I'm mindful of the time. Annalise also talked about prepositions and how in Spanish you shouldn't systematically render prepositions as prepositions, and there are more idiomatic ways to render them. And in this case, I would tell you, it's very much the opposite in English. We have roughly 150 prepositions in English, and we should be using those prepositions. So, and this is very true at many different levels. I find that generally speaking, the more experienced the translator that I'm working with, I do a lot of projects where I work with other translators, the more experienced they are, the more they tend to use phrasal verbs, the more they tend to use rich prepositions that convey sometimes a whole locution in a single preposition like into or through. So more experienced English translators tend to use their prepositions. They kind of keep them as the ace up their sleeve rather than using long and windy expressions. So one quick way that I wanted to point out before we wrap up is that during the pandemic in French, I've noticed a lot of text talking about how people are handling the pandemic, so to speak. And so they'll talk about gérer la pandémie, gérer les effets, or people, les gens qui s'adaptent à un contexte difficile. I've seen so much gérer and s'adapter during the pandemic. And in English, you know, if you say something, you know, let's say we're talking about the isolation of the pandemic, you're talking about managing the situation or managing a situation that isn't easy. Well, that just sounds a little bit odd, doesn't it? I mean, none of us individually can really manage the pandemic, first of all. So it's a bit strange to even use that verb. But when we start thinking more in terms of prepositional little locutions, phrasal verbs, rich prepositions, expressions that make use of prepositions, then we tend to start finding much more interesting solutions that will suddenly start to sound like English. So a few words that, that you might think to use, for example, could be coming to grips with, grappling with, making do with, or getting by in. Coming to terms with, getting along in, dealing with, contending with, or coping with a challenging situation. So this is only one example, but as you start to think more in terms of prepositions and a wide variety of prepositions and phrasal verbs, I think you'll find that your English translations will start to come to life. And sometimes you can even take very abstract paraphrases and render the whole thing with one well-placed preposition. I'm just thinking of an example recently from another text. In French, they were saying, le matin se déroulera en français, l'après-midi aura lieu en anglais. But you can simply say the morning session in French will be dealing with this, and the English session in English will be addressing that. And so that one preposition has actually replaced the verb, you know, se tenir or se dérouler. So when we start thinking in prepositions in English, I found that our translations immediately begin to improve. They get shortened up. They start to sound like English again. So that's one thing that I really have found super helpful in my own practice and that I encourage you all to start using. So to wrap up in English, you know, don't get too carried away with your sentences. Try to make sure that your constructions are parallel and that most of the time you're following subject, verb, object. See if you can drop some unnecessary subjects if you see a lot of problems and issues and initiatives and projects. And think to use prepositions and phrasal verbs. I think you'll find it makes an immediate, tangible difference in your translations. And I find it to be a lot of fun. Annalise before the webinar was saying that with some of the rules of thumb that she uses, it's almost like a game. And I understand exactly what she means. And I suspect all of you kind of see it this way too. When you have a few rules of thumb, it almost becomes like a sort of game of chess or a video game in a way. And you have these tricks up your sleeve that you can use to negotiate all these different situations. So I find it makes it a lot of fun to have some general rules of thumb. So yeah, thank you so much all for being here. I hope you've all taken away at least one tip that can be helpful in your practice. Annalise, I don't know if you wanted to mention your upcoming class. I think you had a class coming up.
Yes, but I first want to say that I loved everything you said because it we didn't rehearse this, so we didn't know exactly what the other person was going to say, but it really made such a great, I think, combination, because we can actually see how things can be applied completely in reverse. You know, how I was like, you were saying how you reduce a verb into a preposition, when you're going into English. And in Spanish, we have, when you're translating into Spanish, we have what we call amplification of prepositions. So we amplify a preposition in English so that in Spanish is a verb plus. So it's funny that, you know, we do exactly the opposite, coming from using two Romance languages. So very insightful to hear everything you had to say, Joe. Thank you for your part. Yes. So I just wanted to say I'm giving a comparative syntax course for translators, English, Spanish, Spanish, English. It's starting in 2 weeks, and yeah, it's going to be in more depth. So we're going to be looking at subjects and verbs and passive voice and yeah, so we are going to send a recording to this for all the registered people, and we'll include the links to some of the courses. You have some courses yourself, Joe, coming up too.
Yeah, I have a course starting next week called Stylistique Comparée Reloaded, which is a 2 half-day webinar through Magistrat. I'll put it in the chat. It's for French into English and English into French translators. And we do examples throughout both half days to look at how the principles of comparative stylistics still apply and which ones have changed in the past 50 years. So it's a really fun webinar, and we look at only modern examples and see how those dusty old comparative stylistics principles can still be helpful today. So if anyone's interested, you're very welcome to sign up. And thank you all for being here. It's just fun doing something like this, and
yeah, definitely
seeing other people and sort of comparing notes. So thank you all.
Thank you all for being here. Yeah. All right. We'll turn the recording off at least. All right. Stop the live stream. All right.